You're tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
Another day in Canada, which means still more attempts by government, specifically in Ontario, to go after churches for wanting to assemble as the Constitution guarantees and as their faiths have commanded them to for generations. Most notably, we see this happening in Aylmer, Ontario with the Church of God. We've had the pastor there, Pastor Henry Hildebrandt, on the show in the past. And this week, the Church of God was back in court again at the behest of the Ontario government, trying to impose more penalties, more findings of contempt. And the judge, after a relatively short hearing, had actually imposed tens of thousands of dollars more in fines on the church and on its pastor. Representing them has been Lisa Bildy, a lawyer with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. Lisa, good to have you back. Thanks for coming on today.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
So this was, I mean, as far as the long-standing back and forth we've seen on this case, was there anything particularly unique about this hearing, or was it just, another round of fines?
Well, it was a little bit different in that it feels like things are maybe settling down a little bit. And even though we were back in court on, contempt proceedings, which is a very serious matter, the last time we did this, the government made sure to tell the court all about all the transgressions and, right to the last minute, telling about any other subsequent services that had happened since they had filed their motion. They didn't do that this time. And I thought that was interesting, and I noted it in court that basically when they had their service on May 16th, which is what we were talking about in the contempt proceedings today, they had 300 people in attendance. And then there were 2 more services, and there were more people in attendance. And so it seems like, as a public health measure, this isn't really working. The more they come down hard on this church, the more people want to turn up and show their support. And so, I think it's interesting that it felt a little bit more subdued this time. And I do hope that, especially as we're moving into the summer and things are starting to open up a little bit more, hopefully, and more outdoor services are going to be permitted in the near future, that the temperature will be turned down on all of this.
I know it came up at the hearing a week and a half ago, which ultimately was the one that was adjourned to today. And the judge had mentioned, there's not much more that can be done. We can keep putting these fines on, but if the church is going to keep continuing to assemble and having these services, which are now outdoor, the government has limited means on this. So in a lot of ways, is the government kind of conceding? I know that was the judge that said that, but is the government conceding that this is sort of just going to be this repetitive process, and that might be why, as you've just said, it's losing a bit of steam?
Well, it could be this repetitive process, but they also could escalate things, and they could make this criminal contempt, and they could seek to have the pastor put in jail. But I think probably most people recognize now, and we've done this a few times in Alberta, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem, and it absolutely hardens people's positions, and in fact probably triggers more people to say, what's going on? Is this really a public health crisis, or is there something else going on? So it's not to the benefit to do it that way.
One comment the judge made at the hearing that stood out was that Pastor Hildebrandt has positioned himself as, and I'm quoting directly here, the face of the resistance in a way. And then he went on to say there are consequences that must flow from that. And that to me seems to reinforce what you've said in court in the past, which is that the government does really seem to be targeting this particular church. I mean, we've learned of rallies that have been taking place elsewhere for any number of causes that have not raised the ire of the state. But they are continuing, or have been up until this week, to really devote a disproportionate amount of energy on this particular church and this particular pastor.
Well, it certainly seems that way, and certainly to him, there have been other rallies, as you know, and in the affidavit that I had quickly scrambled to put together at the last minute before the hearing, when they first the government had brought this, we talked about this in your last show. The government had brought a motion the morning of the court date that we were supposed to respond to. So I had thrown together an affidavit that had some articles about the recent Palestinian protests. And now, of course, those aren't subject to court order. But the reason they're not subject to court order is because nobody's bothered to ticket them and take them to that level of enforcement. But they have done that with a couple of the churches. And so I've been told, so I didn't raise them in my submissions today, but the judge isn't interested in hearing about what's going on with other protests. We're focusing on this church. Did they violate the court order? And the answer is yes. And so really, the arguments that I can make in this context are extremely limited, and they were, because really it's a kind of an open and shut case. There's an order. They knew about it. They breached it. We're done. But I think that is relevant, and I think it's relevant to the broader question of, if we're trying to protect, preserve the judicial integrity, the judicial system's integrity, the rule of law, we can't have certain rules applying to some people and not to others, because the people who are being targeted are, of course, going to take the position that they're being particularly singled out, that they're being oppressed by it. So it is important in a system that is grounded on the rule of law that there be equality of treatment. Now, I'm not saying that there should be fines for the people who were attending the Palestinian protest. They're entitled to protest. They have a good cause, perhaps, that they want to protest it in their view, or not. I mean, that's part of the living in a democracy. People get to express through peaceful protest their views, and whether you agree with them or not. So, I'm all for them having the right to protest, but there shouldn't be a double standard.
I think that's a very important point. And looking forward here, we know that the government has had the doors of the church locked. This is why, the weather's getting nicer, so it works out well that if the church is very much passionate and dedicated about having outdoor services, it's a little bit more tenable now than it would have been, say, in mid-January. But long term, we're starting to see some restrictions ease in Ontario, and I say that with some reticence, and it's a topic that we've covered in different contexts on this show. But suppose the restrictions lift to such a point that it would be viable and lawful in the government's eyes for the church to assemble inside. Are those locks automatically going to come off?
Not automatically, but if we get to the point where we're allowed to have at least 30% occupancy in the building, we have a court-ordered right to come back to court on 2 days' notice in order to try and change the order. And I expect that would be granted. I don't think that they want to be, the judge doesn't want to be unnecessarily punitive to the church. They're not trying to keep them out forever, but as we argued in a previous hearing, when it was at 30%, there really weren't enforcement issues. And so that seems to be a good threshold for allowing them to return inside their building. But unfortunately, the government hasn't really laid out a framework that shows us when this is going to be done, or whether it's ever going to be done. And what's going to happen in the fall is, it's still very uncertain. I don't think we're through the woods on all of this yet, even if it does open a little bit this summer.
So I guess what is the next step here? I know you don't want to be in the prediction game necessarily, but from what you were saying at the beginning of the interview, that it seems like some of the heat's coming off. Are you thinking that this is going to continue, this sort of, lifting the foot off the gas pedal, such as it is, from an enforcement perspective?
Well, I don't know for sure, and I can't predict, and I don't really want to predict. As you say, it is hard to know. It seems like maybe people all need a breather all around. We all recognize that things are escalating, and it doesn't go anywhere good. From the church's perspective, the more they're enforced against, the more people come out. So maybe it's to their benefit on some strange level that more people come out, and as Pastor Hildebrandt has said in his services, they're coming and they're finding Christ, which is his job. His job is, as he sees it, is to save souls, right? So the more people who come out, the better. But from a general societal perspective, from the government's perspective, it really doesn't benefit anybody to keep us coming back into court week after week after week. It doesn't solve the public health issue. It doesn't protect the integrity of the system, particularly in my view. Others may disagree. Frankly, it's a lot of work for the government too, to keep having to come back into court with all these materials, and the relationship with the police also. They're depending on the police to go out to the church every week and to monitor and to gather evidence. The relationship between the community and the police is one that is important not to completely destroy. It takes a lot to develop trust in your police force. These are guys walking around with guns, women too, and they need to earn the trust of their community that they police. And most of them do that. But when things get to the point where they've got drones flying over the church and it really feels like it's very targeted, those relationships get very strained. And I think it probably is good for everybody just to take a deep breath, settle down a little bit and get back to just trying to work together a little bit more constructively.
I know we talked last time you were on the show about the bigger picture aspect of this. The constitutional hearing has been scheduled for this church and other churches in one sort of omnibus hearing in October, so still a considerable period of time between now. When that time comes, will it matter if the Church of God and other churches in this action can point to these services they've been having and say, we haven't seen an uptick in cases, we haven't seen any demonstrable public health challenges or outbreaks from this? Is any of that going to be relevant when these are going to a full hearing on the merits?
Well, I think they're certainly relevant. One of the reasons why we've had all these restrictions is allegedly to control the spread of outbreaks. And as we've learned more about the science, unfortunately, the political measures have not really kept pace with what we've learned. So, for example, there is good evidence now, very solid evidence, that asymptomatic spread is really not a concern. It's something in a meta-analysis of 54 studies, it was concluded, and so that's very good science, by the way, because when you analyze 54 different studies, you're effectively getting rid of any of the deficiencies in any particular one. And they were all done of households where you're getting rid of a lot of the variables. So in 54 studies of household transmission, asymptomatic spread was found only to occur 0.7% of the time. So 7 out of 1,000 times. And so many of these measures that we have are predicated on there being, we have to be fearful of healthy people because they may unknowingly be spreading the virus. And the science is evolving to show us that maybe that is not so much a concern. And same thing with outdoors. The science is also showing that there's very little, like maybe 1% of spread that can be attributed to any outdoor gatherings. So the fact that the churches have been largely, they haven't contributed to any spread in their communities that has been traced to them, I think it's going to be very relevant evidence. And of course, we'll have our expert evidence as well to bring all those studies into court.
Good. Yeah. And look, I mean, I'm a kind of a purist on the constitutional grounds in this sense and saying, listen, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly. But when the government has positioned everything as being a part of these reasonable limits that we all know tend to define the constitutional freedoms, it is very important to be able to say that those limits are not grounded in science. And you're very right that in Ontario and other jurisdictions, the more we've learned about it, at the same time, restrictions also seem to have gone in the other direction. So I appreciate your work on this. Lisa Bildy from the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.